The arrow left her fingers before she heard the sound. That was the problem with hunting near dusk. The light turned everything to shadow, and shadows didn't hold still. Dara had been crouched in the fork of a broad oak for the better part of an hour, and patience was something she had learned out of necessity. The forest along this stretch of border was quiet, in the way forests got quiet when something moved through them. Not the dense, held-breath quiet of a predator. Something smaller, lower to the ground, pushing through the undergrowth in the specific careless way of an animal that did not yet understand it should be careful. She tracked the movement, waited for the shape to resolve. When it did, it was low and quick and exactly the right size for what she had been waiting for. She loosed. The sound that followed was not the sound she expected. It was a yelp, sharp and startled, the kind of cry that came from a creature surprised by pain rather than anticipating it. Dara dropped from the oak before the echo died. She pushed through the brush with her hand, already moving to the knife at her hip, already naming the sick feeling settling into her chest as she closed the distance. The wolf pup lay on his side in the frozen ground, one rear leg extended at a wrong angle. The arrow had caught the outer muscle of his haunch, not the bone, not any vein that mattered, but enough to bring him down hard. He was small, the size of a large cat, with a coat that was almost entirely white except for the faint silver that ran through the fur along his spine and the tips of his ears. That silver caught what little light was left. His eyes were open, dark, almost black in the dim. He watched her come toward him and did not snarl. She crouched 2 feet from him in the snow and held still. He kept watching. "Hold still," she said, even though he already was. "I'm going to take it out." She worked methodically. The arrowhead came free clean. She checked it twice, which she always did, accounting for both barbs before she let herself breathe. The wound bled freely for a moment, and she let it, then pressed dried mosswort from the inner pocket of her coat against the opening. One of the first lessons her mother had given her, back when her hands were too small to properly grip anything. Mosswort before the wrapping, always before the wrapping, because sealing a wound over contaminated ground was worse than leaving it open. The pup's breathing stayed even while she worked. He flinched once when she pressed the compress down with her full weight behind it, and then he was still again. She used her scarf for a temporary wrap. It was her only scarf, which felt like a fair consequence. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it against her cheeks, a sharpness with an edge to it that meant hard frost before morning. A wound that tightened in that kind of cold would swell, and a wound that swelled on a pup this size could become something worse than it needed to be. She told herself that was the only reason she gathered him up. He let her. He was heavier than he looked, solid and warm, and he did not bite her or struggle or even tense significantly when she lifted him against her chest. He simply settled, one ear pressed to her sternum and the other angled back, still tracking the surrounding dark. The cabin sat a good 40 minutes up the ridge in these conditions. She counted her footing carefully, the snow deceptive over the roots and loose stone she knew well enough in better light. She built the fire one-handed when she got inside, which she had done enough times that the difficulty was manageable, and laid him on the folded blanket near the hearth. Under proper firelight, she could see the wound clearly. She cleaned it again with water she boiled first, and replaced the field dressing with something more suited to a real night of recovery. Wrapping joints had been another early lesson from her mother, practiced on carved wooden forms before she was ever allowed near anything living, and the knowledge sat in her hands now without requiring much thought. She worked until the wrap was tight enough to hold and loose enough to allow blood through, and then she sat back on her heels and looked at what she had done. He was watching her. She offered him a strip of dried venison from the provisions pouch. He took it from her fingers without touching her fingers, carefully, and chewed it once and swallowed it and kept his eyes on her face. "You're not what I was aiming for," she said. She moved to sit cross-legged on the floor, close enough to monitor him, far enough to give him room if he wanted it. There was a deer that has since made excellent decisions about its location. I cannot say the same for either of us. He set his chin on his forepaws. "Right," she said. She slept on the floor that night. Not comfortable, but she had slept in worse places, and the fire needed tending anyway. He slept steadily, and without distress, and in the morning she noted this as a reasonable outcome for a situation she had not handled well. The first full day he did not move much, which was expected. She went about the work of the cabin, wood brought in, traps checked, the account she kept of her yields updated with the complete absence of anything worth recording, and he tracked her from the blanket. Not the bright, unfocused way of a young animal looking for entertainment, with attention that had weight to it. When she sat at the table, he oriented toward the table. When she crossed to the window, he oriented toward the window. She noticed it and said nothing about it, which was her general approach to things she could not yet explain. On the second day, he put weight on the leg. On the third day, he moved around the cabin with a careful, deliberate gait, pausing at each wall and shelf. He spent a long moment at the small tin on the shelf by the window, dented at the lid, unremarkable to look at, the only thing in the cabin she had not acquired through her own work. Her mother had pressed it into her hands the last morning of her life and told her to keep it away from cold and damp. Dara had never opened it. She didn't need to. She knew the shape of it by feel in the dark, which was sometimes the most important way of knowing something. The pup smelled it for a long time. Then he looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything, which Dara was beginning to understand was how conversations with him generally went. That evening, she caught him watching her from the far side of the room with an expression she had no category for. Not the bright, indiscriminate attention of a young animal occupied by novelty. Something that had patience in it. Something that felt in a way she could not logically support, like recognition. She went to sleep, telling herself she had imagined it. She woke on the fourth morning to an empty blanket and a cold hearth. The door was still latched from inside. She checked it twice. The small shutter above the kitchen shelf, the one she left cracked for ventilation on nights when the fire ran hot, was pushed open an inch wider than she had left it. Barely enough for something his size. Barely. She stood in the middle of the empty cabin for a moment, looking at the blanket. Then she started her day. He was a wolf. He had healed enough to travel, and he had made his way back to wherever he had come from. And that was the beginning and end of it. She went out and checked her traps and found them empty, and came back and made a small fire and ate, and did not think about the unsettling steadiness those dark eyes had turned on her mother's tin. The second day she stopped listening for sounds outside. The third day she folded the blanket and put it back under the bed where it usually lived. On the fifth morning, she was at the chopping block on the side of the cabin, working through the pile of wood she had been putting off, when she heard the horses. Not one. Several, moving with intent through the snow, following the ridge line toward her specific cabin with no hesitation in the route. She buried the axe in the block and stepped around to the front of the cabin and stood in the open, because she had learned a long time ago that attempting to look small never convinced anyone of anything. 5 riders. 4 wore the heavy, functional traveling gear of men who spent long stretches away from roofs. Not polished, but well made, the kind of equipment that got replaced when it wore out, rather than when something newer became available. Weapons at the hip and across the back. Faces that assessed her the moment she came into view, and then held steady. The 5th rode at the front. She looked at his hands first, then his posture. Settled into the saddle with the ease of someone who had spent more hours on horseback than off it. Broad across the shoulders, dark beard following the jaw, hair the color of bark after rain cut to the collar of his riding coat. He wore no decoration that she could see, nothing at his brow, nothing at his throat. His eyes were amber, the particular warm gold that sometimes occurred in wolves and almost never in men, and they were fixed on her with the same methodical attention she was giving him. Sitting at the front left hoof of his horse, looking up at her with dark and entirely familiar eyes, was the white pup. His leg was wrapped in fresh linen. Someone had redone her work. She looked at the pup. The pup looked back, ears forward, with the expression she had already spent 4 days learning to read. "He found you," she said. "He led me." The man's voice was deep and even, the kind of voice that had long ago stopped needing to be raised to carry. "My patrol post sits half a day's ride north. He came into camp on his own yesterday morning and would not be settled until we followed. He also," he added with the flat precision of someone recording a notable tactical detail, "would not permit anyone to touch the bandaging on his leg until we arrived here. I would have used heavier linen if I'd known it needed to last that distance." It held. You wrapped the joint correctly. His gaze moved over her, unhurried, without hostility, cataloging the same way she had cataloged him. You're not registered with any pack along this border. No. You carry no wolf. No. But you know field medicine. My mother was careful about what she taught me. He was quiet for a moment. The 4 riders held back without instruction, staying far enough that the conversation remained only between the 2 of them. The pup had not moved from his position beside the horse's hoof, though his attention had not wavered from her since she stepped into the open. Under pack law, the man said, injury to the heir of the throne requires an accounting before the court. You'll come with us. As a prisoner, as someone required to answer for what occurred. Whether those are the same thing will depend on what the court finds. He looked at the pup briefly, then back at her. The distinction is not meaningless, even if it doesn't feel significant from where you're standing. She considered it honestly. There was no fight to be made here, and no useful direction to run in. And beyond that, she looked at the pup, at the calm and deliberate way he had positioned himself between her and the riders, and she did not think his leading his father to her door was an act of accusation. What it was, she could not say. That was the part that would not settle. I'll pack, she said. She went inside. The tin she wrapped in cloth and placed in the center of her pack, surrounded by the herb pouches on all sides, insulated from the cold. Knife, bow, quiver. The one change of clothes she owned that was not actively stained with work. She was back outside in less time than it had taken the riders to water their horses at the trough on the side of the cabin. The pup walked to her immediately and pressed against her left boot. The Alpha King watched this without expression. My name is Dara, she said, because no one had asked, and she had decided it should not be withheld. I know. There was something in his voice she could not read. He told me. She looked down at the pup. The pup looked back, ears lifted, with the small, intent focus she had come to recognize as the closest thing he had to satisfaction. He doesn't speak, she said. He makes himself understood. Doggin turned his horse south. He has been doing it since he was born. The rest of us have spent 8 years learning to pay attention. One of the riders brought the spare horse forward. Dara, mounted without assistance, settled the pack across her back and adjusted the bow over her shoulder. The pup moved to the front of the group as they turned into the snow, leading the way south with the unhurried certainty of a creature who had never doubted where this road was going. She had no such certainty, but the chopping block was already behind her, and the tree line was already closing in on either side, and the pup was already well ahead, and there was nothing left to consider. She followed. The first morning on the road taught Dara the shape of the group she was traveling with. There were 4 riders beyond Doggin himself. Hewn, the oldest of them, had a scar that pulled the left corner of his mouth down into a permanent expression of mild skepticism, and he rode closest to her the first hour until it became apparent that she was not going to make any sudden decisions about her direction. After that, he fell back to the rear, where he maintained a distance that was professional rather than punitive. The youngest, a man perhaps a few years older than she was with a dark braid over one shoulder, introduced himself as Corin without being asked, and then seemed to regret the impulse immediately, because Hewn gave him a look that required no elaboration. None of them were unkind to her. They were also not particularly interested in her, which she found easier to manage than either cruelty or attention. Fen rode with Doggin in the morning. By midday, he had migrated to walking beside Dara's horse. She noticed Hewn noticed this and decided not to comment. The terrain changed steadily as they moved south, the sparse, bitten landscape of the border ridge giving way to denser forest, the pines eventually opening into stretches of bare hardwood, with the pale gray sky visible between the branches. The road, such as it was, showed signs of regular use in the packed surface and the cleared shoulders, a working route rather than a ceremonial one. Villages appeared occasionally at distances from the road, smoke above tree lines, the smell of settlement that she had learned to recognize and give wide berth to in her usual movements. She did not give it wide berth now. She simply rode past it with the others and watched from the road and said nothing. Dagon spoke to her exactly twice on the first day. The first time was at midday when they stopped to rest the horses at a shallow crossing. He dismounted and stood at the bank and said, without looking at her, "How long have you been at that cabin?" 4 years, she said. Alone. Yes. He nodded once and said nothing further, which she took to mean the question had been answered. The second time was near dusk when he rode up alongside her for approximately 100 yards before saying, "You didn't ask where we're going. I know where we're going. You said the court." "Most people ask how long." 10 days, she said. "Maybe 11 if the weather changes on the Dern Pass stretch. I've traveled that ridge in winter. It's negotiable but not fast." He glanced at her once, long enough that she could not tell what he was thinking, which was not unusual. He had a face that kept its own counsel. 10 days, he confirmed, and rode ahead. She understood, by the end of that first day, that the group traveled efficiently. Camp was made with the quick, unostentatious competence of people who had done it too many times to find anything noteworthy about the process. Fires went up fast. Food was simple and portioned without ceremony. Fen ate near Dara without being redirected there by anyone, and no one commented on it. And after a while, she stopped waiting for someone too. Dagan sat apart from the group when he ate, which seemed to be a matter of habit rather than rank. He watched the tree line while he did it. Sometimes he watched her, briefly, and when she met his gaze, he returned his attention to the trees without acknowledgement. The second day was quiet. The third was not. They reached the boundary post near midday, a fortified garrison at the junction of two main southern roads, staffed year-round and built to handle exactly the kind of trouble that lived in the gaps between territories. The flag above the gate showed fresh damage at one corner. The gate itself was open, and 2 of the resident fighters stood in the road outside rather than at their posts, which told her the situation inside was recent enough that it had not yet been reorganized. The riders from the garrison met them at the outer perimeter. There had been rogues in the night, 3 of them, the kind that didn't run when they should. One of the garrison men had taken a strike across his left side before the rogues were driven off. The wound was deep and had been treated as best the garrison medic could manage, but the medic here was practical rather than trained, and the treatment had been wrong in a specific way that was now working against the injured man's body. Dara heard this from her position at the back of the group and did not move until Dagan had dismounted and walked through the gate. And then she dismounted as well. Corin looked at her. She handed him her horse's reins. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I'd like to see the injured man." He took the reins. She went through the gate. The garrison medic had done what his training covered and not what the situation required. He had packed the wound rather than draining it, which was the right protocol for injuries he typically dealt with and entirely wrong for what a rogue's strike left behind in the tissue. The man on the cot was conscious, which was fortunate, and running a fever that would become dangerous by nightfall if the packing stayed in. She introduced herself to no one and crouched beside the cot and looked at the dressing and the skin around it and the color of the man's face in that order. His name was Bren. He was 26 years old and had the resigned expression of someone who had already been told he would probably be fine and had started to suspect this was not entirely accurate. "I need water to boil," she said. "Clean cloth, yarrow if this garrison keeps it, and if they don't, then golden seal. And someone needs to tell me if he's been given anything in the last 2 hours." "Who are you?" said the garrison medic, who had appeared to her left. "The wound needs to drain before it's packed again," she said. "The packing is trapping the damage from the strike instead of clearing it. If it stays in overnight, he'll spike into a fever you won't be able to break by morning." A silence. Then Dagan's voice from behind her, even and carrying. "Get her what she needs." She worked for the better part of an hour. The yarrow was not stocked, but the golden seal was, which she had not expected from a frontier garrison, and she said so. The medic, whose name turned out to be Aldvan, stood behind her the entire time with the particular attention of a man watching someone do something he recognized as more precise than what he had been taught, tracking each step without asking unnecessary questions. He was more capable than she had initially assessed, and she revised her assessment partway through and began explaining what she was doing as she did it. Bren's color improved before she had finished. When she stood and washed her hands in the basin Aldvan provided, she became aware that the garrison had gone quiet in a specific way, and that there were more people standing in the doorway of the medical room than there had been when she entered. Dagan was among them. He had not left. She dried her hands and stepped back from the cot and told Aldvin to reapply the dressing after 3 hours if the drainage had slowed, explained the signs that would indicate it hadn't, and recommended that Bren not be moved for 2 days if the garrison could manage it. Aldvin wrote all of this down on a fold of parchment with the focused manner of a man who had just revised his own education. Outside, she walked back to the horses without comment. The sky had moved toward mid-afternoon while she worked. They would lose the best travel hours of the day, which she had already calculated and decided not to mention unless someone else did first. No one did. Corin returned her reins without a word. His expression was difficult to read. She mounted and settled the pack at her back and watched Fen take his position beside her horse and waited. Dagan pulled up alongside her as the group reformed on the road. "Where did you learn that?" he said. Not a question, entirely. Something between a question and a conclusion arrived at and requiring confirmation. "My mother. She looked ahead at the road. She died when I was 6, but she was careful about what she taught before then. After that, I found what I could. Old texts mostly, when I could get them. There's a water mill 3 days north of my cabin that belonged to a healer's family before it was abandoned. There were books in the loft. What was her name?" Dara kept her eyes on the road. "She never used one in front of me. I understood later that she may have had reasons for that. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he had finished. Where was she from?" he said then. "She never told me that either." She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, not her, but she had the sense that he was attending to her answer with full focus nonetheless. She knew things that came from somewhere specific. The techniques she taught me. Even as a child, I understood they were not common knowledge. Where she learned them, or who taught her, she kept to herself. She paused. She kept most things to herself. I spent a long time being frustrated about that. Eventually, I decided she probably had reasons. Dagan nodded once. His jaw had tightened slightly. "Reasons," he said. "That's what I've told myself." She looked back at the road. "It's possible I was simply wrong about her, and she was merely secretive without purpose. But it's not what I believe." He rode ahead after that. She did not call after him. That night at camp, Hune came to sit near her fire unbidden, which was the first time any of the riders had done so. He did not explain himself or make conversation. He ate his food and stared at the flames and eventually said, without looking at her, "Bren's been with that garrison 11 years. Good fighter. He'll be fine," she said. Hune looked at her sideways. "I know, that's what I'm saying." He stood and went back to the main fire. She sat with that for a while and watched the trees. Fen came and put his chin on her boot. His eyes drifted shut within a few minutes. She checked his leg in the firelight. The linen had held, the joint showed no swelling. He was healing with the accelerated efficiency of a young wolf's body, faster than she had expected, even accounting for that. In another week, there would be no evidence of the wound at all. She pulled her coat tighter and listened to the night. The days that followed built a rhythm she had not anticipated finding. They covered ground steadily, passing through stretches of territory that shifted in character the further south they moved. The dense border forest thinning into managed woodland. The managed woodland giving way near the 6th day to the wider, rolling terrain of the inner territories, where other packs' lands began and where the roads became smoother and more traveled. Villages here were larger. The people who looked up from their work as the group passed through did so with immediate recognition. Something in the way they stilled and oriented that she had seen once in the presence of very old, very large animals, and not before in the presence of men. Dagan rode through all of it the same way he rode through everything, forward with the undemonstrative certainty of a man who had long since stopped being changed by the fact of his own significance. She watched him more than she meant to, not because she had decided to, because he moved through every situation, the garrison, the villages, the quiet evenings when the riders debated routes and conditions, with the same measured, unperformative attention, and she found herself cataloging it without having consciously started. The way he listened when Hune reported something. The way he crouched to Fen's level when the pup came to him in the morning, saying nothing but pressing one hand briefly to the silver-tipped fur before standing and returning to whatever he had been doing. He did not treat his son's peculiarities as difficulties to be managed. That was the detail she found herself returning to more than anything else. On the 8th night, She woke before dawn to the sound of Fen moving through the camp and looked up from her bedroll to find him sitting at the edge of the firelight with his gaze fixed on the south, ears pitched forward, alert but not alarmed. She watched him for a few minutes without moving. His breathing was steady. Whatever he was attending to was not a threat. Or if it was one he had already assessed and found manageable. She pulled her coat around her and went back to sleep. She mentioned it to no one. She did not think he would want her to. On the 9th day, the land changed again. The rolling terrain compressed into a wide valley between two long ridges, and at the far end of it, set into the southern ridge with the deliberate occupying permanence of something that had been built to remain, was the stronghold. She saw it first as color, darker than the stone of the ridge but continuous with it, walls that did not stand out from the landscape so much as concentrated. As they descended into the valley and the distance collapsed, scale resolved itself. It was large in the manner of things built to be unambiguous about what they were, not ceremonial, not decorative, built to hold and to project the unambiguous fact of holding. Towers at the corners, gate in the center, iron and timber, and deliberately imposing. The walls broad enough at the top that she could see figures moving along them, the shapes of men against the pale sky. She looked at it and felt nothing specific. Or rather, she felt the distinct and familiar sensation of arriving somewhere she did not know how to read yet, which was different from dread and different from anticipation, and not entirely comfortable either way. Fen walked beside her horse's left shoulder with a steady, unhurried gait. "Tomorrow," Dagon said, riding up on her right. "We'll reach the gate by mid-morning." She nodded. He glanced at her once, brief and unreadable, and rode ahead to where Hune waited with a question about the final approach. She looked back at the stronghold. One more night. One more fire. One more set of sounds the darkness made in unfamiliar territory. One more morning waking without the exact silence that belonged to her ridge and her trees and the cabin she had apparently vacated for good without having consciously decided to. She made camp when the others stopped, laid her bedroll where the firelight reached and the wind didn't, and listened to Fen breathe himself to sleep beside her. He did not wake once in the night. In the morning, they rode on. The gate opened before they reached it, not thrown wide, controlled, measured, 2 guards pulling the iron mechanism with the coordinated timing of men who had been watching the approach from the walls since the group entered the valley. Dara rode through third, behind Dagon and Hune, and the noise changed immediately. Outside had been open air and the ambient quiet of cold landscape. Inside was enclosed sound, stone amplifying the clatter of hooves and the movement of the men who materialized at the corners of the courtyard to take the horses. She dismounted and held her reins until one of them reached her, and while she stood, she took in the space. The courtyard was large and functional. Training equipment along the far wall, targets worn through repeated use, a forge visible through an open archway to the left, coals banked but recently active. A stairway along the inner wall leading up to the ramparts, 2 men on the first landing watching the new arrivals with the open, measuring attention of people who found strangers professionally interesting. The attention was not limited to the men on the stairs. She felt the court before she saw most of it, the weight of eyes from doorways and windows, the way the courtyard movement adjusted and slowed as people registered the group coming in and specifically registered her. Not Dagon, who they clearly expected, and not the riders, who they knew. The pause settled around her with the particular texture of a group of people arriving at a collective question. A woman appeared from the main entrance, middle-aged, carrying herself with the compact efficiency of someone responsible for a large number of moving parts. She went to Dagon first, spoke low, received a response, glanced once at Dara with an expression carefully stripped of readable content, and then moved to organize the courtyard traffic. Corin appeared at Dara's shoulder. "I'll take you to your rooms," he said. They were in the east wing, 2 levels up, a bedroom with a sitting area, both clean, both adequate, with a window that looked out over the inner ward. A guard station at the end of the corridor, which she noted and accepted as consistent with what Dagon had told her. She was here to answer for what had occurred. Rooms with a guard station were what that looked like. She put her pack down and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the stronghold settling back into its own business around her. Fen appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later. No one seemed to have brought him. He simply arrived, as he had been arriving at places he intended to be throughout the journey, and settled in the corner nearest the window with the self-contained quiet that was his default state. She looked at him. He looked back. "This is going to be interesting," she said. He set his chin on his forepaws. The formal hearing was set for the following morning. Dara spent the remainder of the day in her rooms, not from instruction, but from the straightforward assessment that introducing herself to a court that was already forming opinions was not a useful exercise. She heard the stronghold around her, voices in corridors, the distant sound of the training yard resuming, the particular concentrated activity of a large household in the hours before the evening meal. She ate what was brought to her and watched the light change in the window and went to sleep early. The great hall in the morning was full. Not packed. This was not a spectacle, or was not intended to be, though the distinction felt somewhat academic given how many people had found reasons to be present. They lined the walls, the household staff, and the senior fighters, and the men and women whose bearing said counsel or advisors, and they watched Dara walk the length of the hall toward the raised platform where Dagan sat in a carved chair that was functional rather than ornate. She stood in the center of the floor and did not fold her hands or drop her gaze, because neither of those things would have felt honest. The questions were asked by a man who stood to Dagan's left, formal, structured, covering her name, her location, her affiliation or lack thereof, the events of the evening in question, and her actions in the days that followed. She answered each one directly. She had not known what she was shooting at. She had not known whose lands she was adjacent to, because the border in that area was unmarked. She had no pack, no allegiance, no history with the court, or any intent toward the heir. Each answer landed in the hall, and she watched people receive it and decide what to do with it. Most of the questions were being answered before they were finished being asked, because they were the obvious questions, and she had already anticipated each one. The harder part was not the questions, but the room. The weight of that much collective assessment focused in one direction, which was a thing she had not experienced in her life on the ridge and found more effortful than she would have predicted. When the formal portion concluded, the man to Dagan's left conferred briefly, and then announced the findings. No criminal intent established, no known affiliation with any hostile party. Then he turned to Dagan for the verdict. Dagan looked at Dara for a moment. His expression gave nothing. "The investigation into her origins remains open," he said. "The final determination will follow its conclusion." He stood. "She remains in the stronghold until that determination is made." The room shifted. Not dramatically, but she caught the specific quality of the stir along the walls, the way 2 or 3 of the older council members exchanged glances. This was not what they had expected. She filed that away without showing it. She turned and walked back through the hall. Fen fell into step at her left heel from somewhere she hadn't seen him. No one stopped her. No one spoke to her directly. 2 women near the door moved to allow her passage without meeting her eyes, and a senior fighter watched her leave with the particular expression of someone running a calculation that had not yet resolved. She spent the afternoon in the inner garden, a walled space off the east corridor with dead winter beds and a stone bench and the compressed gray quiet of a place that was used in better weather, but empty now. She sat on the bench and watched the sky between the high walls and let the morning settle. The sound came on the 3rd day. She had been in the east corridor returning from the kitchen, where one of the house staff, a woman named Grizz, who had decided, apparently, that Dara would be treated the same as anyone else, regardless of what the hall thought about it, had given her a cup of broth and information about where the useful things in the stronghold were located. Dara was navigating back toward her rooms with the particular focus of someone still mapping a new space when she heard it. Low, first, almost below the range of easy hearing, a sound that was less auditory than physical, something that pressed against the sternum rather than the ears. Then rising, not into a scream, but into something between a sustained note and a voice, edged with distress and going nowhere, like a sound trying to escape a sealed room. She traced it to a door 2 chambers down from her own rooms and pushed it open without knocking. Fen was on the floor, not unconscious, not injured, but his eyes were wrong, open and fixed at a point several inches above the floor, not tracking, his body rigid with the specific stillness of something under internal pressure rather than external restraint. A young man she recognized as one of the junior council members was crouched 2 feet away, not touching him, his face showing the particular fear of someone who had seen this before and had not yet found a way to become accustomed to it. "How long?" she said. "Since I came to bring him to the hall for... It doesn't matter. 10 minutes, maybe more." She crossed the room and sat on the floor directly in front of Fen, not crowding him, close enough that he would register her presence before anything else. "Fen," she said. The sound didn't stop. But its quality shifted, the fixed, sealed intensity of it opening slightly at the edges, the way a door shifts when the pressure on either side of it changes. She didn't reach for him. She waited, close, and said his name again, the same way. His eyes moved, slow, struggling through whatever had them, but they moved and they found her face and stayed there. The sound dropped, not immediately. It wound down, like something running out of the energy sustaining it rather than being switched off. His body loosened increment by increment. She watched his breathing change, the rigid set of his shoulders releasing a degree at a time, and she stayed still and kept her eyes on his, and waited until he was fully back and the room was quiet. He stared at her. She held out her hand, palm up. After a moment, he put his paw in it. "There," she said. "All right." She became aware that the doorway was no longer empty. Dagan stood at the threshold. She did not know how long he had been there. His expression was the one she had stopped trying to interpret, held together with the careful containment of a man practicing a skill. But his eyes, those amber eyes that she had catalogued on the doorstep of her cabin and on horseback and across campfires for 10 days, were doing something she had not seen them do. He looked at his son in her hands and then at her, and she watched something go very still in his face. The junior council member made a small movement toward the door. Dagan stepped aside to let him pass without looking at him. He looked at Dara. She looked back. Fen's breathing had returned to the even, unhurried rhythm of sleep. He hadn't closed his eyes, but he had lowered his chin to her knee, and the weight of it was warm and steady. Dagan stayed in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he turned and left. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, measured and unhurried, moving away. She sat with Fen until his eyes drifted shut entirely, and then she shifted carefully and settled him on the rug and went to her own rooms. That night, the wolf inside Dagan, the part of him that had spent 2 years running cold, oriented outward, away from everything inside the stronghold's walls, stopped pointing at the window. She did not know this. She knew only that when she passed him in the corridor the next morning, he held her gaze for a full breath longer than the day before, and that there was no expression she could name for what was in it. The man who found her on the 4th afternoon was not Dagan. She was in the inner garden again, the empty winter beds, the stone bench, the stripped branches of the plants that would become something else in spring. She heard his footsteps on the path and looked up to find a man she had seen in the hearing room but not been introduced to. Old, thin, with the kind of deliberate posture that had been constructed over decades to suggest authority without demanding it. Gray mantle, a scholar's hands, eyes that assessed her with a precision she recognized as the kind that took in details for later use rather than for present conversation. He sat at the far end of the bench without asking. "You've caused considerable discussion," he said. "I expect that's not news. I haven't done anything since I arrived except sit in a hearing and walk corridors." "Yes." He looked at the dead garden. "That's something of the point. You arrived, and the heir of the kingdom attached himself to your side, and the Alpha King delayed a verdict that any prior case would have concluded in a morning. You've done nothing except exist here, and already the court has several distinct opinions about what your existence means." He paused. "I am Galt. I manage the archive and council on matters of precedent. What does precedent say about my situation? It says that you should have been released with the verdict this morning." He turned to look at her. "The investigation into your origins is not a standard provision. It's unusual. It draws attention to you in a way that is not, I would suggest, beneficial to anyone, including you." She looked at him. "What would be beneficial to me," she said, "is the verdict that follows the investigation." "Of course." His voice did not change. But these things take time. And in that time, you are here, which creates a set of dynamics that I've seen produce unhappy outcomes for people in similar positions. My concern is practical. The court's discomfort with your presence tends to find a direction eventually. It would be a shame if that direction found you before the investigation concluded. He stood. I simply wanted to ensure you understood the climate. It's often the things no one tells you directly that produce the most difficulty. He walked back to the door without looking at her again. She sat on the bench until she was certain he was gone. Then she went to find Dagan. He was in his study. She had learned where it was from Grizz, who had proven consistently useful. And when she pushed the door open, he was standing at the window, not working, which she read as a man who had too many things to hold at once and had chosen to hold them in a room he could control. He turned when she entered. Galt found me in the garden, she said. He spoke to me about my presence being inconvenient. He was careful to say it as concern. She stopped in the center of the room. It wasn't. Dagan's focus sharpened. She told him what had been said, the sequence of it, the specific words Galt had used, and the ones he had been careful not to use. She was precise, because precision was what the situation required, and because she had the sense, standing in front of this man, that imprecision would cost something. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he moved to the shelves along the inner wall, not the working shelves, the deeper ones at the back, the kind that held things put away rather than things in current use. He ran his hand along the spines of the bound ledgers until he found the one he wanted and pulled it free, opened it, moved to the second shelf and pulled another. He was cross-referencing something. She watched him move through 2 more volumes and then stop. The ledger in his hand was older than the others. The binding had been repaired at the spine at some point. He looked at a specific page for a long time, and his jaw set in a way she had not seen before. Dagan, she said. He closed the ledger. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his expression had been reorganized into something careful. The sealed archive, he said. There are records there that require my seal to access. The seals are dated. He set the ledger on the desk. I know when the last time one of those records was opened before my seal was required. The date doesn't correspond to any inquiry I authorized. Galt, I don't know that yet. You believe it. He considered her for a moment. I believe I need to find out what's in that record before I know anything else. He moved toward the door and paused with his hand on the frame. Don't go to the garden alone, not until this is settled. She agreed. He left. She stood in the study a moment longer, in the charged quiet of a room that had just become significant. Then she went back to her rooms, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the window until Fen appeared in the doorway and came to settle at her feet, and the weight of him against her boots was steady and warm, and for that night, enough to keep the ceiling from feeling like it was moving inward. The sealed archive was in the lower level of the stronghold's north tower, behind a door that required 2 keys, one held by the archivist, one held by the Alpha King. Dagan had gone there the previous night after the study, after Dara had left. He had not told her this. She learned it from Grizz in the morning, who had seen the light under the archive door past midnight, and who offered this information with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned that useful information was best delivered without editorial commentary. Dara ate her breakfast and waited. The summons came before mid-morning. Not Corin this time, Hune, which meant something. He walked her to the council chamber without speaking and opened the door and stood aside. The council chamber was smaller than the Great Hall and arranged without ceremony. A table, chairs, the kind of space built for conversations rather than audiences. Dagan stood at the far end of the table. 3 senior council members sat along the right side. Galt stood at the near end, and when Dara entered his face did not change. But something in the way he was standing went very carefully still. The ledger was on the table. Beside it, a second document, older, the parchment showing the particular brittleness of age at the edges. She could see from the doorway that it bore a seal at the bottom. She could not read the date from where she stood, but she did not need to yet. Dagan looked at Galt. The seal on that record was broken recently, he said, within the last week. which means someone opened it after Dara arrived, which means someone knew what it contained before any investigation was requested. He waited. Explain that. Galt's expression was composed and had been composed, she suspected, for a very long time. I accessed the record to determine whether it was relevant to the current situation. That is within my function. Your function is to advise on existing precedent, not to make unilateral determinations about what I should and should not see in my own archive. Dagon's voice was even. That particular evenness, she had come to understand, was not calm. It was the state his voice arrived at when he had moved past the point of needing to signal anything with volume. You also failed to bring the record to me, which means you assessed the content and decided I shouldn't have it. I assessed that the timing was poor and the content would create instability during an ongoing... Read it, Dagon said. Not to Galt. He was looking at Dara. She crossed to the table and picked up the older document. The parchment was dry under her fingers. The writing was formal, the hand careful and deliberate, a record meant to last. It began with a date, 18 years ago, almost exactly, and a designation she did not recognize. Silentis, surviving lineage, border registration withheld by order of the Alpha King, first of that name, not Dagon, his father. She read on. The Silents were recorded as a lineage of partial shifter inheritance, carrying the blood in a dormant form, never manifesting, the wolf present in them only as a trace that shaped certain capacities without producing the shift itself. The document used language that was administrative rather than editorial, which made it more disturbing in a specific way. The wording around why the lineage had been suppressed was careful. Potential complications to existing succession arrangements. Potential interference with established alliance structures. The existence of the lineage was not illegal. Its registration simply had not been renewed. Its members were not formally expelled. They were simply not welcomed back if they left. At the bottom of the first page, a name. Dara's mother's name, which she had never heard spoken, written in the same careful administrative hand. Edith of the Borderline, Silentes carrier, registered departure from Pact territory. 18 years ago. She turned to the second page. A follow-up notation, 2 years earlier than the main record, which meant 20 years ago, which meant before Dara was born. Edith had applied for re-entry to the territory. The application had been reviewed and declined. The reason given was one line: alliance integrity. The notation was signed not by Dagon's father, but by Galt. Dara set the document down on the table. She kept her eyes on it for a moment, because she needed the moment. She tried to come back, she said. No one answered. The answer was in the document. She tried to come back before I was born, and Galt turned her away. She did not look up yet. And then she had me. And she spent 6 years in the border territory with nothing. And she taught me what she could. And then she died. She looked up. And Galt found me alone, and left me in the forest. The chamber was very quiet. I found the child, Galt said. He had dropped the careful composure by a degree, the first time she had seen it move. The child was in border territory with no registered guardian, no pact claim, and no documented lineage because the lineage had been suppressed. There was no legal mechanism to bring her into the stronghold. There was no case to be made. There was a child, Hune said from the doorway. His voice was flat. There was a child in a legal and political situation that had no clean resolution. I made the assessment that the least harmful course... You left her in the forest at 6 years old, Dagon said. The evenness was still there. But underneath it now was something that had no composure covering it. Galt looked at him. I ensured she was left near enough to the mill settlement that... I know what you did. Dagon moved past the end of the table and stopped when he was close enough that there was nothing ambiguous about the distance between them. I also know what my father did, and I know what neither of you told me when I was arranging the succession alliance, and I know what neither of you told the court's healers when Fenn's episodes began, and there was no one who could... He stopped. The sentence didn't need to finish. Every person in the room completed it. The Queen had been brought to the stronghold 17 years ago as a political alliance, and she had been a good woman, by every account Dara had heard in her days here. She had tried. She had sat with Fenn through every episode for 8 years, and she had not had the blood that could absorb what those episodes pressed outward. And the effort of it had worn something in her down to nothing over years, and she had died of it in the slow, unspectacular way that things died when they were used past their limit. There was a healer in the border territory for 18 years. There was a woman whose blood was built for exactly this, living alone outside the mapped world, because two men had decided that existing alliances were more important than what the old lineage records said about her. And the queen had died anyway, and Fen had gone on suffering, and none of it had been necessary. Dagon turned away from Galt and did not turn back. "Remove his keys," he said to Hune. "Both of them. He's to have no access to the archive and no access to the council chamber until I determine what other records he's managed on his own initiative." He paused. "He's not to leave the stronghold." Hune moved. Galt said nothing further. He had the expression of a man who had run out of arguments and arrived at the place where arguments didn't matter anymore. She watched him walk to the door ahead of Hune's direction, and she felt nothing particular about the sight of it. It was not satisfying. It was just what came next. The council members filed out behind them. One of the older women paused at the door and looked at Dara with an expression that was not apology and not acknowledgement, and was somehow both, and then she left as well. The chamber was empty except for Dagon and Dara and the documents on the table. She looked at the second page again. The notation at the bottom, 2 years before she existed. Alliance integrity. "The records say she's buried," Dara said. "My mother." "Yes." His voice was different now. The evenness had dropped. 3 days south. There's a village. It's marked in the follow-up notation. Galt kept records of what he did. He was very thorough. He said the last sentence with a careful flatness that did not disguise what was under it. "She has no name on the grave." She had read that in the document, a small line near the end of the notation. No registered name marked. She understood that this too had been deliberate, and she did not say so because the room was already full of things that didn't need to be said to be present. She picked up the original document and read her mother's name again. Edith of the Borderline. She had never known it. She had known her mother's hands and her mother's voice in the specific hours before sleep, and the way she said certain words when she was teaching, the specific patience of that voice. And she had known that her mother had kept most of herself sealed behind something Dara had spent years mistaking for reserve. She had not been reserved. She had been protecting something. She had been carrying the weight of a refusal she had received 20 years ago, and the 6 years of border territory that followed it, and she had still, carefully and completely, taught her daughter everything she knew. Dara set the document down and did not cry, because the grief for this was not the kind that moved quickly. It was the kind that would be with her for a long time and that she would need to carry in whatever shape it settled into. She looked at Dagon. He was watching her with the expression she had stopped trying to categorize. But there was something in it now that was not complicated, something direct and without the layers of management she usually saw there. He was tired. That was part of it. But it was also something else. "Your father knew about the lineage when he arranged the alliance," she said. "Yes. And he didn't tell you. He made the assessment that an arranged alliance was more stable than the old succession provisions. He was not wrong about the political logic of it." He paused. "He was wrong about the cost." She nodded. "Fen's episodes," she said. "They were worse after the queen died." "Yes, because she had been absorbing some of what came off them, even without the right blood. She was absorbing what she could, and it was not enough, and it killed her." She kept her voice level. "And you've been blaming yourself for 2 years." He was quiet. "You didn't know," she said. "Dagon, you didn't know what she needed and no one told you." His jaw tightened. "I could have looked harder. You looked at what was visible. Galt made sure that was all there was." She held his gaze. "That's not the same thing." The room was quiet for a long time. She picked up the documents and held them out to him. He took them. His fingers were close to hers when he did, not touching, but close enough that she was aware of the space between them in a way she had not been aware of spaces before. She left him in the chamber. The rest of the afternoon moved slowly. She went to her rooms and stayed there, not because she had been told to, but because she did not have the capacity for the stronghold's corridors and their populations at the moment. Fen came and went, Out for 2 hours, back for 1, out again. She appreciated the pattern. It left her alone when she needed it and returned company when she had been alone long enough. Near evening, she went to the battlements. The walkway along the east wall was exposed to the full cold of the open sky, which was the reason it was empty. The sun was dropping toward the western ridgeline, and the valley below was settling into the long, gray light that came before dark in winter. The particular color of it that she had seen from her cabin for 4 years, and recognized now in a different frame and from a different height. The stronghold spread below and behind her, its sounds muffled by the wall and the wind, and out ahead of her was the valley and the tree line and the distance back to the north. She stood at the parapet and looked at it. She did not hear his steps on the stone behind her, which she noted only because she had become accustomed to hearing most things before they arrived. He was quieter than she expected for his size, or she had been less attentive than usual, which was its own information. Doggin stopped beside her at the wall. He did not begin with anything formal. He stood with his forearms on the parapet and looked at the valley below, and was quiet for long enough that the quality of the quiet became its own thing. Not uncomfortable, not requiring management, just present. "I don't know what you are to me yet," he said finally. His voice was low, not for privacy, but because the statement was the kind that didn't need volume. "I've been trying to be careful about that. There are provisions in the lineage records that I haven't finished reading, and there are things I don't fully understand yet about what the Silentes connection means in practice." He looked at the tree line. "But I know that Fen led me to your cabin. And I know what I saw through that doorway 3 days ago. And I know that whatever I've been telling myself about the appropriate weight to give any of that, it isn't landing the way I intend it to." She looked at his profile in the low light. "I'm not going to disappear again," she said. "If that's what you're working towards saying." He turned to look at her. "I mean it practically," she said. "I don't have anywhere to go that's better than here. My cabin is empty and the traps were running cold before I left, and the only thing there that mattered was the tin on the shelf, and I have that with me." She looked back at the valley. "I'm not leaving, not because of records or provisions or anything else. I'm making a choice to stay, and I want you to know that's what it is." He was quiet for a moment. "Then stay," he said. It came out simpler than he had probably meant it to, and something in his expression acknowledged this. Not embarrassment, but a kind of stripped-down honesty that she had not seen on him before. "Stay and let me finish what needs to be finished with the archive, and then we'll talk about the rest of it properly." She nodded. The sun touched the ridgeline, and the valley went the deep amber gray of imminent dark. Below them, the stronghold began lighting its torches, the small orange points of fire appearing in sequence along the inner ward, and the smell of wood smoke reached them, even up here. She did not move toward the door. He did not either. They stood at the wall as the dark came in, not speaking, and the cold was significant, and the wind was steady, and neither of those things was sufficient reason to leave. The morning after their time on the battlements, Dagan gave no formal announcement about Dara's status in the stronghold. He simply stopped treating it as provisional. She noticed this in the way things changed without ceremony. Her name appeared on the household roster that Grizz maintained, which meant she was now allocated meals and supplies through the regular channel rather than through whatever improvised arrangement Corin had been managing since she arrived. The guard at the end of her corridor was gone by the second morning. Hune, when he passed her in the east wing, gave her the same short, acknowledging nod he gave the senior household staff. Not warmth exactly, but professional recognition that she was here and had reasons for being here that he had accepted. The court took longer. Courts always did. She did not push against it. She went about what she found to be useful, which was primarily working alongside the stronghold's healer, a compact, exacting man named Drest, who had been skeptical of her initially and became less so with each passing day. His methods were sound, but his herb stocks were poorly organized, and he had a habit of reaching for the same 2 remedies regardless of the specificity of the problem in front of him, which she addressed without commentary by simply demonstrating alternatives when the situation provided an opening. By the end of the first week, he was asking her questions. By the end of the second, he had restructured the storage shelves according to a system she had suggested and was writing things down when she explained her reasoning. Fen spent his mornings with the household tutors and his afternoons wherever he chose, which was often wherever Dara was. She had stopped finding this notable. He was easy company, attentive, unhurried, possessed of opinions he expressed without words in ways she had grown fluent in without entirely meaning to. When she was working, he settled at the edge of the room and stayed there. When she was idle, he found ways to occupy the space between her and whatever she was doing that felt less like intrusion and more like presence. Dagan moved around all of this with the particular care of a man who was thinking more than he was saying, which she had come to understand was his natural state. He sought her out most evenings, not by plan or not by acknowledged plan. He would appear in whatever room she was in near the day's end and find something nearby to occupy himself, and they would talk or not talk, and the quality of both had shifted since the council chamber in ways she was still charting. He told her about his father on the third evening. Not the full account. There were limits, she understood, to what a man who had spent decades as the center of other people's accountability could easily disclose. But pieces of it. His father had been a man of supreme practical intelligence and genuine political skill, and had also been someone who experienced the distance between right and convenient as fundamentally negotiable. He had passed this off as pragmatism, and it had looked enough like wisdom to go unchallenged for a long time. Dagan had spent years inheriting the consequences of decisions his father had framed as strength. She told him in return about the mill, about finding the loft on a morning in her 9th year when she had tracked an injured rabbit to the building and found the hatch in the ceiling and pulled herself through it into a space that smelled of dry rot and old paper and had, improbably, held. Stacked against the inner wall, wrapped in oilskin, gone brittle with time, but still intact in the places that mattered. A collection of texts that she understood only partly at first and more completely each year as she returned. The rabbit had escaped. She had considered that a reasonable trade. He listened to this without filling the pauses. She found she was grateful for that. On the 14th day since arriving at the stronghold, he came to her door in the morning before she had left for Drest's workroom. She opened it and he said, "I want to take you south, 3 days, to the village." She looked at him. "I've had the grave marked," he said. "Properly. Her name." He held her gaze. "I thought you should see it." She pulled the door open wider and said, "Give me a few minutes." They rode out with Hune and Corin, 4 horses on the southern road in Heir that had the thin, clear quality of winter, giving reluctant ground to the season trying to follow it. The trees along the road showed the first reluctant evidence of change, a faint warm tinge at the tips of the branches that would be leaves in another few weeks. Fen had tried to follow them to the gate, and Dagan had crouched to him and said something low that she had not heard. And the pup had sat at the gate and watched them go with those steady dark eyes that she was not sure she would ever fully read. The village was small, unremarkable, the kind of settlement that sustained itself quietly at the edge of larger territories without drawing attention in either direction. They reached it on the 3rd day as the afternoon light was going orange and long across the fields. The graveyard was at the village's east edge, walled with old stone, the kind of place that had been receiving the village's dead for several generations. Dagan led her to the right section without consulting anyone, which meant he had been here already. She noted this and did not say anything about it. The grave was not large. The stone was new. She could tell from the clean edges, the way the carving had not yet had time to weather. The name was cut clearly, Edith, Silentes line, border territory. And beneath the name, a single line that had not been in the administrative record and that Dagan must have decided on himself. She taught well. Dara stood at the grave for a long time. She did not cry. The grief was present, had been present since the council chamber, would be present for a long time yet. But it was not the kind that moved through and out quickly. It sat, and she was learning to sit with it. Dagan stood slightly behind her and to the left and said nothing. She felt his presence the way she had begun to feel it generally, as a specific weight in the air, a direction she was always peripherally aware of, the way you were aware of a fire in a cold room. She had not said anything to him about this. She was not certain she had the words for it, or that the words existed in a form that wouldn't seem like more than she was ready to say. When she turned away from the grave, He was watching her with the direct, unguarded expression she had seen only a few times, and that still surprised her each time. "Thank you," she said, "for the stone." He nodded once. They stayed in the village that night and rode back the following morning. The return journey felt different than the outward one in a way she couldn't specify precisely. Something settled rather than pending, as though the trip had resolved a particular weight she had been carrying since the archive and had not fully set down. Back at the stronghold, spring began arriving in the way spring arrived in cold places, argumentative, non-linear, 3 days of thaw undone by 2 of frost, but with a net direction that eventually accumulated into something real. The training yard was occupied from earlier in the morning. Drest's workroom became busier as people moved around more and found new ways to injure themselves. The inner garden lost its abandoned quality, and the household staff began tending the beds with the focused intent of people who had been waiting for an outlet. Dara worked and was useful, and found that being useful in a place where people eventually stopped watching to assess her and started watching because they wanted to know what she was going to do next was a different experience than she had expected. Not easier, more textured. Fen's episodes became less frequent. When they came, she handled them. Dagan no longer came to the door to observe afterward. He came in and sat until Fen was fully back, and then stayed for an hour or more, the 3 of them together in the deep settled quiet that had become familiar. A message arrived on the 28th day. She was with Drest when Hune came to the door and said that Dagan needed to leave for the northern border, a territorial dispute that had become a crisis in the way border disputes became crises when both parties involved ran out of patience at the same time. He estimated 10 days. He came to find her before he rode out. "The episodes," he said, "I can manage them." "I know." He held her gaze for a moment. "That's not why I'm telling you." He said it simply, with the exact economy of a man who had decided that the direct route was less dangerous than the careful one. "I'll be back in 10 days. "I'll be here," she said. He rode out within the hour. The stronghold was different without him in it, which she noticed and found informative about the state of her own interior. Not diminished. It ran exactly as it ran. The staff did their work. Drest ran his workroom. Hune managed the guard rotation with the same thoroughness he applied to everything. But there was a register missing from the frequency of the place, a specific weight absent from the rooms she moved through, and she was aware of it the way she was aware of silence where there had been sound. She worked. She spent extra time with Fen. She went to the inner garden in the evenings and watched the beds coming back to life under the spring attention they were receiving. On the 6th night, she was woken past midnight by the sound she had learned to move toward. Fen's episodes had a sound that she heard now before it fully registered as sound. A low, pressing quality that she felt in her chest first, the body understanding before the mind did. She was on her feet and in the corridor before she was fully conscious of the decision, and at his door before the sound had reached its full distress. He was worse than she had seen him. The tension in his body was total. Both eyes fixed at a point above him with the locked, inward attention of a man underwater. Sweat stood at his temples. His breathing was wrong. Not stopped, but compressed, the lungs working in the shallow, rapid way of something under sustained pressure. She moved to him immediately and sat at his side and placed her hand flat on his sternum. "Fen," she said, "come back." He didn't move. She kept her hand where it was and kept her voice steady and said his name again and again, not varying the tone or the volume, not adding urgency to it, because urgency would give the episode something to press against, and she had learned that the absence of resistance was more effective than the presence of counterforce. She breathed deliberately and let her breathing be something he could feel through her palm. The sound did not stop, but it shifted. She stayed with it. The minutes passed in the counted, specific way of minutes that required accounting. She held the contact and held the tone and kept her breathing even, and at some point, she could not have said precisely when, the tension in his body began its increment by increment release, and the sound wound down, and his eyes found her face, and stayed. She waited until his breathing had fully returned to normal, until the rigidity was completely gone, and he was just a child on a bedroom floor, looking up at her with the face of someone who had been somewhere very far away and had found a direction to come back from. "There," she said. "You're all right." He pressed his nose against her wrist. She sat with him until he fell asleep, and then she sat for a while longer because the room felt like the right place to be. 3 of the household staff had been woken by the sound and had looked in and seen the situation and withdrawn. Grizz had appeared at some point with a blanket that Dara found draped over her own shoulders without having registered its arrival, which she appreciated. In the morning, Drest found her in the workroom and told her that in 22 years he had not seen Fenn's worst episodes resolved without at least 2 people and the full duration of their natural length. The previous records showed them at 4 to 6 hours. Last night had been under 2. She organized the shelf she was working on and said she was glad it had gone well. Dagen returned on the 10th day, earlier than she had tracked, in the early afternoon, with dust still on his coat and the specific look of a man who had moved faster than the conditions recommended. He came through the courtyard and found Hyun, who spoke to him briefly and gestured toward the east wing. She was in the inner garden when she heard his boots on the path. She looked up from the bed she had been helping with. The first spring planting, the household staff tolerating her assistance with the good-natured indifference of people who had decided she was acceptable, and he came around the corner of the wall and found her there. He stopped when he saw her. "Hyun told me," he said. "It resolved." She stood, brushing the earth from her hands. "He's been fine today. He's with the tutors." "That's not—" He stopped, looked at the garden wall, the bare spring branches starting to show their green, the beds being brought back to life. Then back at her. "Dara, it was a bad one," she said. "The worst I've seen. But it resolved." He crossed the garden in a few strides, and the wolf in him was not contained the way it was when he was being careful. She could feel it in the air between them, the way she had learned to feel the shift in atmosphere before weather changed, a pressure and a warmth and a direction. His hand came to her face, palm against her jaw, and she looked up at him. "I know what you are to me," he said. It was not the opening of a discussion. It was a conclusion arrived at over a long distance. "I know," she said. His thumb moved along her jaw. The amber of his eyes at this proximity was not one color, but several, layered, the gold and the darker amber, and at the edges something almost copper. And they were fixed on her with the complete, undivided attention of a man who had run out of reasons to look anywhere else. "I want to claim you," he said. "Not the lineage records, not the old succession provisions. I want you. My choice." He waited. "If it's yours." She reached up and covered his hand with hers. "It's mine," she said. "It's been mine for a while. I've been waiting for you to get to the same place." Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, too large for that, too settled. As if a counterweight that had been keeping a door closed had simply, finally, been removed. He kissed her in the garden with the early spring dirt still on her hands and his travel coat still carrying the dust of the northern road, and the wolf in him was warm and certain and completely, absolutely still. The formal declaration was the following morning. She had not requested the formality. He had determined it was necessary, not for her, he said, but because the court needed to understand that what was happening was not provisional and not subject to revision. She stood in the great hall again, in front of the same assembled faces that had assessed her when she arrived, and the difference in the room was not subtle. The composition was the same. The air was not. Fenn stood in the front row in his human form, which he used rarely, and had apparently decided this occasion warranted. He was wearing a dark tunic that was only slightly too large for him, and his silver-touched hair was more organized than usual, which suggested someone had made an attempt that he had partially cooperated with. He watched Dagen declare the claim. He watched Dara receive it. His expression throughout was the expression she had been learning to read for weeks, the particular satisfied quality of someone watching an outcome they had been expecting for a very long time. The court witnessed it. Hyun witnessed it. Grizz, from the back of the hall, witnessed it with her arms folded and her face making the expression that she made when things resolved in the direction she had been hoping they would. Before the hall dispersed, the same councilman who had questioned her at the original hearing rose and stated, for the record, that the inquiry into Dara's origins had concluded and that no claim against her remained pending before the court. It was a dry administrative sentence. It altered the room nonetheless. When Dagon's hand found hers, the wolf in him sent something through the contact. She felt it along her arm and through her chest, warm and specific and entirely unlike anything she had experienced before. The mate bond completing along pathways she hadn't known she had, a door opening in one direction without the possibility of closing in the other. She felt her own blood answer it, not with a shift. She had no shift, no wolf to rise, but with something older and quieter, the Salente's inheritance doing what it had been built to do, absorbing the full weight of what his wolf offered and holding it steady. He felt it too. She could tell from the way his hand tightened on hers. The weeks that followed arranged themselves around the new shape of things. She moved her few belongings to his rooms, which took less than an hour because she owned almost nothing, and found she was not troubled by this. She was acquiring a life here with more texture than she had owned before. And the tin from the shelf of her cabin sat on the new shelf in the new room and caught the morning light the same way it always had, and that was the continuity that mattered. Fen began sleeping through the night without exception. Drest noted this in his records with the careful understatement of a man who understood its significance, but preferred not to be dramatic about it. Dara noted it too, privately, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem solved at its actual root. The border dispute that had taken Dagon north resolved through negotiation over the following weeks, which freed him to be present in the stronghold in a way he told her one evening he had not been able to be in years. The council reconstituted with 2 new members after Galt's removal and ran cleaner, he said, than it had in a long time. She listened and asked useful questions, and he began telling her things without being asked, which she recognized as a form of trust that was different from and more significant than the others. She learned the stronghold the way she had learned the forest. Slowly, by attention, by being in it through all its different states, the cold early mornings and the busy afternoons, and the character of its nights, the way it sounded when rain came in from the north ridge, and the way it smelled in the courtyard after the forge had been running, and the way the great hall changed character entirely when it was empty versus full. She let it learn her back. One morning she woke before him and lay in the gray pre-dawn quiet and understood, with the particular clarity of a body that had spent years learning to pay attention to itself, that something had changed. She held the knowledge for a moment, checked it, the way she checked anything important, against what she knew from years of work with other women's bodies. The specific signs, the early ones, the ones that came before the obvious ones, they were all present. She lay still for a few more minutes. Outside, the spring birds had started their pre-dawn business, the particular chaotic optimism of birds who had decided the cold was over. The room was warm. Dagon's breathing beside her was slow and even. She got up quietly and built up the fire and stood looking at it. She heard him stir when the room grew warmer. He found her at the hearth and stood beside her and looked at the fire, and she looked at it too. And the silence between them had the dense quality of a silence that was full rather than empty. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. She had thought she would need to find words for this moment. She had been composing them, loosely, without fully acknowledging she was doing it. But she looked at his face, and the words simply were not necessary. She watched the comprehension move through his expression with the unhurried certainty of something that had been expected. And the wolf in him went still, more completely still than she had ever felt it. The absolute motionless of something that had arrived at the place it had been traveling toward and recognized it completely. He did not say anything. He pulled her to him and held her against his chest, and she felt his breathing change, deep and slow, and the mate bond between them was warm and certain and unambiguous. They stood at the fire for a long time. The door to the chamber opened. Fen stood at the threshold in his sleeping clothes, silver-tipped hair thoroughly unorganized, expression carrying the unmistakable quality of someone who had come to the right place at the right time and had done so with full intention. He looked at his father. He looked at Dara. He looked at the general vicinity of the space between them with the focused attention that meant he was communicating something. Dagon looked down at him and said, "You knew." Fen looked back with the particular calm of someone for whom this conclusion was not news and had not been news for some time. He has a name, Dagan said. He looked at Dara. He's been working on it for weeks. He showed me yesterday. Wouldn't tell me why yet. She looked at Fen. What's the name? He padded to the desk and found the piece of parchment she recognized as the one she had seen him carrying for the past several weeks, always tucked somewhere, always near. He brought it to her, and she looked at it. The letters were his tutor's precision, but the choice was clearly his. He had written it once, carefully, in the center of the page, a girl's name. She looked at Fen for a long moment. He looked back at her with those dark, layered eyes that had been watching her since she first opened them in the middle of a cold forest floor, with the patient, certain, deeply satisfied quality of someone who had seen exactly this morning, in exactly this light, with exactly this fire burning from the beginning.